We are again celebrating the end of the year virtually, and again with our traditional end of the year speaker, Professor Anatoly Lieberman, who is with us now from the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch at the University of Minnesota. He has recently informed me that in the title of the department's name, a comma is now required before and. And other than that, things are there as they have been for some time. Last year, we announced the appearance of his annotated translation of the works of Evgeny Boratinsky, a great poet of the Russian Golden Age. 2 highly positive reviews of the book have appeared since then. In summer, Professor Lieberman's voluminous book titled Father and Son, or The World Without Borders, came out in St. Petersburg. The book in Russian is based on the diaries or the journals he kept about the growth and development of his son for 30 years. It begins with the baby's birth and stops on the day when the youth leaves home to go to college. Closer to home, his book, An Explanatory and Etymological Dictionary of English Idioms from Adam's Bosom to Zoot Suit, has been accepted for publication by the University of Minnesota Press and is due to appear before long. So in the field of Germanic, Anatoly specializes in historical linguistics, mainly phonetics and word study, medieval literature, mythology, and folklore. And today's talk, with its discouraging title, naturally deals with folklore. So we're delighted finally to make this happen.
All right. So should I? All right. I'm now spotlighted, and I'm very pleased to speak to you, though I'm tremendously discouraged by the fact that we're so late, and let us hope that all the rest will go much better. I'm going to speak about the fairy tale, as you know, and it is a familiar part of oral tradition, which deals with at least 3 main genres: myths, heroic poetry, and then the fairy tale. And all that, of course, is connected with what we call popular culture, or at least in some way with popular culture. Today's popular culture is mainly urban legends and things of this type, and I'm not going to say anything about it. As far as I understand from our format, I'm supposed to speak for about 45 or 50 minutes. Then we're expected to have questions, and I hope that there will be questions. Since this is a Zoom meeting, we do not have all the time in the world. We used to walk around the room in the past and with our sandwiches and our wine and talk until we had exhausted the subject. Perhaps today I'll skip a few things that I was going to say in order to leave questions for enough time for the questions. In any case, for me to know whether there are questions, it would be good if I have something in the chat room section, or raise hand, so that I would more or less be able to calculate how much time I have and how much time we have. Even though I'm going to speak about the mythology, about the fairy tale, I'm going to say something about other things first, something that will make the context of the whole talk clear. That is, I have to say something about myths and about heroic poetry. Otherwise, the place of the fairy tale and the question and the discouraging title about the hopelessness of our endeavors to understand where the fairy tale came from will be lost. So a few things about the myths and their origins. Myths are, of course, about deities, about gods and goddesses. And the important thing to me is not the origin of the myths, which is a huge question, something that has been discussed for years, if not for centuries, but the main features of the characters. And the characters are gods and goddesses, the deities, and those deities are well known from Greece and Rome, and less known from Scandinavia, unless you have read something about Thor and Odin and other great other great gods and goddesses. But their features are known rather well and are not very difficult to describe. With very few exceptions, they're immortal. I say with very few exceptions because there is a famous story of the god Balder who was killed. But other than that, gods are supposed to be immortal, and their immortality is their main feature. What is more important is that the actions of the gods are guided mainly or only, mainly is probably a way to save myself from some criticism, but mainly by expedience. The gods are not good or bad. They have certain things or feats to perform, and this is the way it is. They are not good or bad, kind or evil. They do what is good for them at this moment. And that is why they're above morals. And that is something that happens only in myths. Just as fire or floods cannot be good or bad, they're elemental events. And in this context, we cannot speak about morality or about morals. And that is what happens to the gods. Another thing, I'm only highlighting those elements which are so very important in connection with the fairy tale. Family relations are of no importance to the gods. They're supposed to be married and they're supposed to have children, but these events are not really very important. Zeus is everybody's father, and Odin is everybody's father. He's even called All Father in Scandinavian mythology. But that's not really important. Those families are not true families. Thor is, returning to Scandinavian mythology, Thor is the son of Mother Earth and has a wife. But these are illusions. There are no families. And they're really asexual, though they have their love adventures, Zeus, Jupiter, and Odin. But these are not true love adventures in our sense of the word. The important thing, the reason why I'm saying these obvious things, is that creating a family is not part of mythology in any sense of the word. And that's probably some of the gods and goddesses are asexual, which is surprising. For years I've been wondering why Athena is a virgin and why Artemis is a virgin. Why should these goddesses be virgins? Well, probably because their past, their remote past, is such that we have nothing to say about it. They were once multitudes. The word Venus, for example, Latin Venus, is neuter. They were all neuter plurals, like the word gods in Scandinavian mythology. They're not supposed to have any sex life. And even though we do have some amorous adventures, that is really as far as it goes. So this is what I wanted to say about myths, because these details will be of very important, very great importance in the main part of my story. Now we can come to heroic poetry with their classical heroes, as we know from the Iliad, for example. And the Iliad is there, and Beowulf is there, and Chanson de Roland is there. That is all the famous West European and pre-West European Greek and Roman stories. The classic hero is very much like a god, but he is usually mortal, or always, or even always mortal. And that is the great difference. And he is not above morality and above morals. The great hero has approximately the same enemies as the gods of mythology. The enemies are either monsters or tribal enemies. And in mythology, it's the same thing. Fighting giants, fighting chaos. The hero of heroic poetry also tries to fight chaos, though this chaos is personalized. Usually some monster, some python or some Grendel, someone along these lines, or tribal enemies. From time to time, enemies come from abroad and the great hero vanquishes them all. That's, of course, why he's there and why he's so very important. Family life, again, is not very important in his life. The hero is usually married, as we know from the Iliad. Sometimes in Beowulf, strangely, he's not married, but that's probably Beowulf was put together by a monk, and probably because nothing was known about Beowulf. We know something about his parents, but no, not about his mother, but we don't know anything about his family life. There is no family life, which is very unusual. But all the others usually are quite different and not unlike Beowulf. When we compare what happens, because my next point will be, of course, the fairy tale, when we come to mythology and to myths and heroic poetry, we find something, and that is one of the key words that I'm going to use in my talk. In this, we find that the motifs, that is the main situations, are more or less the same. Those who have studied folklore are familiar with the word motif index. Motif indexes exist not only for folklore, but for all kinds of tales. You can have a motif index for absolutely everything. You can read a book, David Copperfield, for example, and put together a motif index. What happens there? What situations occur there? That will be your motif index. Now, when we compare heroic poetry and myths, the motif index or motif indexes are practically the same. We deal with the same situations, and these situations are quite familiar. Let us say the god is born or the hero is born. Quite often we have something about the birth of the hero, and that's a typical motif index. Then there will be heroic childhood, where the hero turns out to be a precocious hero. He can do a lot of things, kill giants and fight enemies at the age of 7 or 8 years old. He sometimes fights his father. That is the same thing in mythology. We know that the father and son dilemma is a very common dilemma in myths, where the hero, where the god has to kill his father because the father tries to kill him. There is some naive rivalry between the two. And the same in heroic poetry. This precocious young man, incidentally in myths, we have, of course, gods and goddesses, but in heroic poetry, the hero is always a male because he has to kill dragons and fight enemies. He's a soldier, and gods are not soldiers. They're giant killers rather than soldiers. But the motif indexes are very similar. And that is why in folklore, motif indexes have been put together. And these motif indexes show that if you want to combine myths and heroic poetry, you will get the same results. You will have a great youngster. You will have sometimes some family life, that is parents, not really beyond that. And there is no great difference. But the difference is really very serious. It is the difference because there are no morals in myths, and there are morals in heroic poetry. And the hero is sometimes dead, sometimes not. In Celtic and Slavic heroic poetry, the hero returns home, and we all know King Arthur's cycle. And in that cycle, the hero, the knight of the world famous round table, regularly returns home for another feat. He is never killed. He is very often tempted. Sometimes he has all kinds of trials and tribulations, as the Green Knight, for example, in Middle English. But he always returns home, whereas the great Greek hero is killed. Germanic and Greek heroic poetry is intrinsically tragic, and mythology is not tragic. If there are no morals, there is no tragedy. There is eternal fighting, and though Scandinavian mythology ends in the end of the world, that's not the tragedy of individuals, of individual gods. So the motif indexes are the same, but the stories are quite different, and everything is different there. Now I come, of course, to the main part of my story, even though half an hour too late. That's why I said so little about the first two parts of what I was supposed to tell you. And I know that those who are specialists among the audience, you know these things, but the fairy tale will be something that will probably give you ideas that have never occurred to you. What happens in the fairy tale? First of all, the term fairy tale is much less obvious than the term myths and the term heroic poetry. So many tales are called fairy tales, but the fairy tales, especially those who have read the Grimm's book or Charles Perrault's stories, they will think that almost everything is some sort of fairy tale. But the Grimm's book, much more famous, the most famous fairy tale book in the world, the Grimm's tales contains all kinds of tales. The fairy tale, something that I'm going to speak about, is a very special type. It's usually a male tale. From this point of view, it is very much like the heroic tale. So it looks like an echo of the heroic tale. There are, of course, fairy tales which are female fairy tales, Cinderella, for instance. But I'm going to speak about the male tale, because those of you who have read those tales know that the Cinderella type is extremely rare and the male type is extremely common. So let me give you the plot in outline. What is a classic fairy tale? By a classic fairy tale, I mean the European tale, which is late. We have nothing which is later than the middle of the 16th century, and that's Italy. Then we have Perrault, and that's about a century later. And then the Grimms, that's the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century. And then we have the great collections inspired by the Grimms from Scandinavia, especially from Norway, and from the Slavic world, from Russia, for instance. And the male type is practically the same in all those tales, though I'll ignore more or less the Italian tale, which is tremendously gentrified. It's better to deal with the Grimm's tales, the Norwegian and the Russian tale. So this is what is the male tale. I'll skip the introduction to the tale, because the main thing is point one here. The hero leaves home. That is the beginning of every classic fairy tale. The hero leaves home, sometimes for no reason whatsoever, because he wants to show himself to the world and learn the world. That's, of course, only a pretext. Sometimes the hero has a dream, and in that dream, he sees the most beautiful maiden in the world. So he wants to find the most beautiful maiden in the world, and he goes out into the world. So these explanations are naive, and it's very clear to the storyteller, too, that they're naive. The story begins with the hero leaving home. And that is not what we find in myths, and that is not what we find in heroic poetry. In heroic poetry, there is always some reasonable provocation. Enemies appear. There is no enemy in the fairy tale. So, point one. That is, of course, an outline. That's not the same in every tale. The hero leaves home. He leaves home for no reason whatsoever. So there should be some plot to explain what he has to do. He usually meets someone in that classic tale, whether he wants to find a bride or whatever. He meets someone who tests him. That's a very important part of the story. He usually asks questions and has to be helped. In one of the stories, he says, I'm so hungry. And, and our son, who incidentally, unlike the great god and unlike the great hero, is the third son, and the son who has been very aptly called male Cinderella. That is, he is despised by his brothers, even despised by his parents. He is supposed to be the dummy of the family. Very often there is some task to perform, for example, to catch a thief. The first brother tries to do it, the second brother tries to do it, and then the third brother says, let me try to do so. And the parents say, no, you are a dummy. You are a wimp and a dummy, and you will never be able to do that, to catch a horse or to find a thief. But he implores the parents, goes and say, well, all right, go if you want to go. And he meets someone whose function is extremely important and who never exists in either myths or in heroic poetry. He meets someone who asks questions. And usually the only task is to answer these questions sweetly. That is, the first brothers also met this man, and they were asked, where are you going? And they answered, none of your business. Ah, says the mysterious person, none of my business. Okay, go ahead. And then a disaster happens. And unlike those, the third brother says, oh, you see, I have a very difficult task. I have to do something. Or I have really nothing to do in the world. I simply want to see the world. Oh, that's what you want to do. That's a very worthy task, says this mysterious person. I'll go with you. And they go together. Or I'll come with you. And they go out into the wide world. Nothing like that anywhere in heroic poetry. The hero may have servants or have a troop of knights, but he does everything himself. Now the hero, whether with or without this person, whom I'll call, as he's always called, the magical helper, they go together, and they have nothing to do, but they always walk into some town. And a town exists in a fairy tale for one person only. There is a princess there, and our hero walks in and meets a princess. This princess is a very unpleasant lady. She wants to marry, but she wants to marry only the greatest hero in the world. None of that in mythology, but something like that in heroic poetry, though a different thing. When a great hero travels all over the world and finds, again, that's almost a term, the hero maiden. He overcomes her and leaves her. And then many years later, he usually meets someone who turns out to be his son. Nothing like that ever in the fairy tale. So there's a princess. And after that, there is something which is called the heroic task. The princess wants her prospective husband to be smart and strong. But the tasks, as they have reached us in the fairy tale, are extremely stupid. Very seldom they are good. That is, I'll give you a riddle, and you will have to answer this riddle. That is the situation of the Princess Turandot. If you answer the question, my riddle, if you solve the riddle, I'll marry you. If not, off with your head. And the lady shows him the stakes with all the heads there. So many people already, so many men tried to solve the riddles. Can you see their dead heads? Will you try? Well, he of course tries. The hero always triumphs in the story. So it goes on very nicely. But sometimes the story is stupid. The heroine says, do you see this ring? Yes, I'll throw it into the water. Get it. That's such a terribly stupid task. Of course, there's a helpful fish which will produce the ring. And then, or the princess sits on top of a glass mountain and says, you have to ride up this glass mountain and then I'll marry you with the help of the magical helper, always with the help, either helpful animals or someone, the helpful person, this magic helper, helps the hero, and he's there on top. Then the princess is sweetness itself. Yes, she's married to help you, and the idiotic end after all this context, and they live happily ever after. I wonder whether they really live happily ever after. There is absolutely nothing to predict this universal happiness, but they always live happily ever after. Nothing like that in heroic poetry, nothing like that in the myths. That's entirely new. And sometimes the magical helper does more than this. For example, the hero has to eat a mountain of bread. Nobody can eat a mountain of bread, but the magical helper says, "Oh, I'm ravenously hungry." So he eats the mountain of bread. No, that's not enough. Now you have to drink a whole cellar of wine. So the princess who wants to have an alcoholic for her husband. No, he cannot do it. But the magical helper appears and says that, "Oh, I'm so thirsty. 1, 2, 3, and the whole cell is empty." Even that is enough. There are always 3 tasks. And that is not necessarily so in myths or heroic poetry. Finally, not in the Grimm's, because the Grimm's tales are for family life and for children. But in Norwegian and Slavic tales, there is one more thing. The hero has to go through the ordeal of the wedding night, which is known from Germanic heroic poetry, from the Nibelungen. And here the magical helper says, "I won't be able to help you." That is, if you want to be the husband of your princess, you will have to deflower her yourself. That I cannot do for you. But sometimes in Norway, for example, he gives a lot of good advice. Remember, she is not a princess. She's really a troll woman. And you have to do something to get rid of her troll skin. And he gives all kinds of advice. Sometimes it's very cruel advice. You have to beat her, and then that terrible skin will come off. Or you have to make her take a bath in hot milk or something, all kinds of stories. But the terrible ordeal, the first night, cannot be performed by the magical helper. Something that happens in the Nibelungen, and that's the nucleus of this tragedy. The real husband must do it. That is the prospective husband, not the magical helper. And then they live happily ever after. So the question is, what's the origin of the fairy tale? I'm coming then to my fateful question, which is promised in the title, with a terrible promise that we'll never find out. So what do we want to find out? Point 1, if there are some points here. Motif indexes don't tell us anything. They are the same everywhere. It's very easy to say, "Oh, of course, it's the same situation." No, the situation is not the same. It's even not partly the same, not partially the same. The situation is quite different. The usual 19th century idea was heroic poetry grew from myths, and the fairy tale grew from a combination of myths and heroic poetry. This is all very good if you deal only with the motif index, because the motifs, as I said, are very similar. You can play with the motifs, but the result will be more or less the same. You cannot derive heroic poetry from myths. But the origin of myths, however hard the problem is not so hopeless. People believed in gods, in spirits, in the multitudes that control our life. So you can see the development of mythology. I don't really mean mythology, I mean myths. The development of myths. You can follow the way from the most primitive types of faith to such extremely humanized myths as we find in ancient Greece. So there is some progress. In heroic poetry, there is some logic. The hero fights national or tribal enemies or monsters. So he is really a dragon killer. If you want one label for the hero of heroic poetry, call him the dragon killer. The dragon killer. Now you come to the fairy tale, and the motifs are so familiar. Yes, there are monsters to kill, but the magical helper kills them. And not all the stories have dragons. Stupid, improbable tasks do not exist in myths. A great god has to kill great monsters. A great hero has to kill real dragons. Nothing like that happens in the fairy tale. The fairy tale has one great new motif, which is totally incomprehensible. Pay attention that we are dealing with a dummy, with a third son, with a male Cinderella. I see that there is a question, but and I'm glad that David is here. I'll be happy to answer any questions when I'm done. So we have a dummy, and this dummy marries a princess. Who has ever seen a dummy marrying a princess in heroic poetry? And the storyteller is entirely on the side of the dummy. And that's the first, you can call him dummy, you may call him weakling, do it whatever he is. Weakling is probably a better word. But the fairy tale is all on the side of the weakling. That is absolutely new. So what do we have to explain about the origin of the fairy tale? We have to explain why folklore, call the whole thing, call everything folklore, why folklore has suddenly changed its focus, why it suddenly began to defend the weakling. No society ever favored the weakling the way the fairy tale does. Point one. Point two, I'm very much in a hurry, I'm sorry. I see that's already almost 5 o'clock, and I have to say some important things about the hero. Pay attention to one more thing that has to be explained, because I'm speaking about the original fairy tale. So what do I have to explain? This attitude, the change of attitude, this ability to favor the weakling. Point two, did you ever pay attention to the fact that the hero of the fairy tale has no name? That is, sometimes he's called Ivan, sometimes he's called Jack, or usually John. That's not a name, that's a label. Everybody is an Ivan, everybody is a John. It's nothing, it's Tom, Dick, and Harry. This is not a real name. But when you read mythology, every god and every goddess has names, of course. In heroic poetry, what is heroic poetry if Achilles is not Achilles? If the hero is not Roland, if there is no Oliver, that is, you have real figures. The third son is nameless, and the princess is nameless. She is just a princess, not only nameless, and he sometimes has derogatory labels. He's called simpleton, and he's called simpleton throughout the story. So the simpleton, the nameless simpleton marries a nameless princess. I must add something to it. No ancient society, no medieval society could deal with characters without names. You cannot say anything without names. You cannot say that one day suddenly somebody met an enemy and killed him. There should be somebody called Beowulf, and there should be a monster called Grendel. If the monster is not called Grendel, that's not a monster. You need the name. And if there is no name, there's Grendel's mother. At least there is some affiliation. Only the dragon is nameless in Beowulf, but that's because it's a generic enemy. No names, absolutely no names. The parents are nameless. Then, so we have to point two. We have to explain why is the fairy tale centered around or at or about a nameless character, that is Mr. No One, that is this Ivan, John, Jack, not a name at all. That is totally inexplicable. We do not have any explanation for that. Then the great hero of heroic poetry and the great god always returns home after the deed. It's especially clear with the Green Knights, but it's also the same thing with Beowulf and everybody. Beowulf kills Grendel and returns home. That's of course what he's supposed to do. Now look at what happens to the hero of the tale. The hero marries a princess. Let me go back to the beginning. The hero leaves home. That's point one, the very first motif in the fairy tale. Leaves home and goes out into the wide world, marries a princess in a different kingdom. After the king's death, as we all know, he inherits the second half of the kingdom and becomes king there. He never remembers his parents. And these are the 3 points that need an explanation. Point one, why the weakling? Point two, why nameless? Point three, why he never returns home. Every theory dealing with the history of the origin of fairy tales always tells us about motifs. Not a single one can explain these 3 things. But have there been attempts to explain something? The nameless thing is something that has occurred only to me. I don't think anyone paid attention to the fact that the hero is nameless and how hopelessly and dangerously unmedieval it is. Now, the reason why the hero doesn't return home and why in a different place, these questions have been addressed without much success. And before I say something about it, I have to ask a question of Michel. It's 5 o'clock. Do I still have any time to say anything, or should I shut up? And
No, feel free to go ahead. Yeah.
May I go ahead?
Yes.
Then I'll say, all right, then I'll say at least a few things. I'll very quickly, unfortunately, say what the attempts have been to answer these hopeless questions. So these are the questions. I'll only mention these things. There is a library of books on each of the theories. The earliest one, the famous solar theory. All tales are about the travel of the sun over the sky. It's very weak in the morning, as is our weakling. Very good. Then it becomes becomes very strong. Then there are eclipses. The hero kills an enemy, and then there is no princess in this story, but triumphant, he does not return home. The sun begins in the east and finishes in the west. What a beautiful theory. It's connected with the name of the great scholar Max Müller, and it's a dead theory today, but you cannot imagine how popular it was in the 19th century and what a really great scholar Max Müller was. I'm not even trying to say a bit about it, just list it so that I shouldn't suddenly appear as the great discovery of something. The next one, which was the opposite idea, was the anthropological ritualistic theory, which is connected with the name of the great folklorist Andrew Lang. He was, of course, much more realistic. Let me answer only, or highlight only 2 points. Why the third son? What is this curse that is the third son that is triumphant? when we know that it's usually the first son who inherits everything. Now, Andrew Lang was an extremely smart person. He said, don't forget, there were two systems of inheritance, primogeniture and ultimogeniture. According to one system, the first son inherited everything. According to the other, the youngest son, who remained with the parents after the first sons, the first, second, third, 21st son left home, of course, he is the darling of the family. He inherits everything. This is very good. Does that mean that all the fairy tales were written or composed by the youngest son? Is that what the origin is? Another explanation by Andrew Lang, also never stupid, nor is the solar theory stupid, let me say, about marrying a foreign princess. Why a foreign princess? Well, there were two types of marriage, exogamous and endogamous. According to one system, you were supposed to marry a girl around the corner in your own tribe. According to the other system, you had to go away and marry the woman in another tribe. Question. So all the stories were written by those people who belong to the exogamous system. I'm only saying how very shaky all these theories are. Then came the great initiation theory. Initiation is something that young men undergo in all societies. We also have our initiation when we get a driver's license. And initiation, when a young boy turns into a man officially. And what we find in the fairy tale is what is usually told in the process of initiation. What kind of stories the initiate, what kind of trials and tribulations the initiate will undergo. This is St. Eve and Prop. These two people believed that all fairy tales are initiation stories. Then came Freud with his sexual theories. Then came Jung with his archetypes. They all tried to explain the origin of the fairy tale. Even if I hadn't lost the first 20 minutes, I of course would not have had the time to discuss these theories. But I want to mention them to say that that the question that I have asked is very old. The questions are very old and very important. There are really two main questions. Never mind the sun, never mind Andrew Lang and everything. How old is the fairy tale? That is the main question. All the theories that I have only enumerated and said, given them short shrift, I'm sorry. All these theories presuppose first that the stories are extremely old, and second, fairy tales, I mean fairy tales, not stories, fairy tales. And the second is that they're pan-human. There are two words, monogenesis and polygenesis. That's the question that is the curse of all folklore. When we read folklore, we find that the stories are very much the same all over the world. Does it mean that they all appeared in one place like the human race and spread all over the world? Or did they migrate from place to place? Both theories are quite reasonable when we deal with folklore. Undoubtedly, everything, beginning with Max Müller, down to Jung, they all thought that there was polygenesis. That is, that such stories appeared everywhere for some good, legitimate reasons, and that's why we have what we have. That they're pan-human, and not only pan-human, but that they're extremely old. I must disappoint everyone from Max Müller to Jung by saying the following. There is absolutely no fairy tale preserved in any ancient culture. Romances, late romances in Greece, myths in Egypt, everywhere, in Rome, in Western Europe, yes. Heroic poetry, yes, everywhere. All fine. The fairy tale, nowhere. Is it ancient? I would dare say, even if those in the audience are going to devour me, that the fairy tale is late. It's not pre-Renaissance. It's, of course, we have stories, Italian stories already recorded in 1550, but they don't seem to be much older than that. Also, are the fairy tales aristocratic by origin, or are they part of the so-called popular culture? Now, the stories in the 19th century, the fairy tales in the 19th century were all recorded from peasants. Never mind the Grimms, but real stories like Norwegian tales and Russian tales, all from villages. Does it mean that they were peasant stories? Well, these are strange peasants because they all marry princesses and become kings in the long run. Wishful thinking? Probably. Perhaps every peasant wanted to be king, but that's not a very good explanation. In any case, my main point is that the fairy tale is not old, and that makes its origin even more mysterious than we think. If it is late, how come that we don't know its origin? If it is just shortly pre-Renaissance, we have so many books and so many stories, and there is really nothing. All of a sudden, Italy, then France, and then the rest of it. This looks almost like an insoluble riddle of folklore. Then believing in polygenesis is very hard. They say that the real cradle of fairy tales and old folklore that we have is perhaps in the East, India and Iran. Read India. Do not repeat the word India and Iran. Read what we have there. 1001 Nights, Mahabharata. There is nothing like that there. Aladdin. Aladdin is not our third son. He is, of course, a poor lad. That's true. But it's not a story like the one we have. Then pay attention to one of the most important things. What's the focus of every fairy tale? Marriage, creating a family. This is something that is not at all important in heroic poetry and not at all important in myths. It's a story about creating a family. Why should there be such an extremely rare focus? These are the questions that have never been answered. Let me, I know that I have to stop here, and I know that I have garbled the story because I began so late, but let me sum up some of the things. Why do I think that the origin of the fairy tale is insoluble? Because it's probably late, which is a terrible puzzle. If it is late, we don't know how late it is. Doesn't seem to be much pre-Renaissance. It seems that those who lived in the days of Boccaccio and the Decameron had all kinds of legends, like the Decameron, all kinds of stories. Incidentally, nothing in the Decameron looks like our fairy tale. All kinds of stories with some legends, with some stories, some elements which do look a bit like it, but no fairy tale, no simpleton of that type. Nothing in India, nothing in Persia, in medieval ancient Persia. It's probably a European invention. Because that's where the fairy tales are so popular. Where? Where is the place to where it all started? Italy, probably. How did it all spread? Is the fairy tale aristocratic or popular in origin? Two theories, of course, exist. Those who are very fond of glorifying the people say, of course, popular. Those who don't say, no, it's aristocratic. And then using the term in folklore, it went down and became popular among the peasants. Well, it looks very aristocratic, I'm sorry to say. Something like Twelfth Night or Shakespeare's comedies. It seems that is approximately where the whole thing started. Somewhere after Canterbury Tales, something post-Chaucerian, that's the nucleus. How then did these stories spread all the way, let us suppose, from Italy, but that's just to give a name, from Italy to Russia? That's a long way. And to Norway, that's a long way. Norwegian and Russian tales are truly peasant tales. What happened in between? What kind of intermediaries? That we don't know. So it's the place of origin that is a riddle. It's the time of origin that is a riddle. The focus on creating a family, which is a riddle, which we do not find anywhere else. The glorifying of the nameless weakling, that has to be explained. All the theories that are known to me, and I have spent decades reading these theories, they all compare motif indexes. If we compare motif indexes, the answer will be very easy. If we say, as they said in Latin, this is the place, here you must jump, hic salto, then these are the questions that we must discuss and answer. I have no answer. I don't know where the stories began. I think somewhere in Italy. I do not know how they spread. I don't know how they managed to reach Norway and Russia and become so typically popular tales. I do not know why they deprived the hero of the name, why they glorified the weakling. The weakling is not glorified in any popular culture. I don't understand why the hero doesn't return home. I don't understand why there are so many nubile princesses in another kingdom who are ready to meet our friend. I don't understand the origin of the magic helper, so totally unheroic. These are the questions. These are the questions that would be interesting to discuss if there is any point in discussing them. And so I promised a hopeless title. I will finish with a hopeless denouement. Thank you very much. Sorry for the garbled beginning. Sorry for my hurried rush through my outline. But most of what I wanted to say, I said, though I did not give some of the examples which I wanted to give. I know that there have been some questions from David and from Jim, and there are probably some other questions. And in any case, I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Anatoly. That was wonderful, even though we didn't get an answer to the question, but it was a great talk. And thank you also for being willing to answer the question. So I don't know if people who had raised their hands earlier, if they're interested in asking their questions now.
I think I've killed the dragon.
Maybe you answered it in the latter part of the.
That's probably the questions that were to be asked. I have in some way made them so hopeless that nobody wants to ask them. That will be a tremendous anticlimax.
Just read an email from Marco.
Yes, there are emails here, but I don't know whether.
He came and it turned out by Zoom.
Yeah, I don't know whether I can read my email now while I'm on Zoom. I know that there were 2 notes from David Markle, but that's all I have seen. But now with the screen being all on Zoom, I cannot read my email here.
Yeah. I don't know.
Michelle, can I ask a question orally?
Yes,
Of
go
course.
ahead.
Anatoly, do you have an explanation or a theory about the difference between, let's say that it's correct that they originated in roughly the period of Boccaccio in Italy, the difference between those fairy tales and the fairy tales in Scandinavia and Russia?
The difference between Norwegian and Russian tales and?
Versus the Italian origin.
Yeah, no explanation really. It seems that in Norway and Russia, the most interesting European fairy tales, incidentally, they have their national focus there. With Italian fairy tales, were hard put to it because the Italian tales, which we have from beginning with the 16th century, the middle of the 16th century, and later, they're so gentrified. If we take such a classic example as Love of Three Lemons, known from Prokofiev's ballets, Loves of Three Oranges. That's about a prince, not about a weakling, and not at all, though very much like the same. They are very Italian, and not only gentrified, even the same, of course, is true with Perrault. This is what makes them so different. Then they clearly traveled all over the world, and they became truly peasant tales. The hero, it's very interesting to see how the national character cultures, how the culture colors the hero. The German hero in the Grimms, they were pre-Grimm tales too, but from the Grimms, he is asked to do something, for example, to take an axe and cut off the mountain. What does the German fairy tale hero do? He sits down and weeps. And then the magical helper appears. The Norwegian fairy tale hero takes an axe and hammers away. He realizes that he, of course, can't do it, but at least he tries. And that is something. Russian fairy tales are very Russian, and Norwegian tales are very Norwegian. But the question is really more or less the same. The plot is the same, and the morale is almost the same. There was one question which somebody thanked me, but I don't know whether there was a question or not.
We have a few questions coming in the chat that I could read. Connor Brock.
All right.
Yeah, Connor Brock asked, would East and Southeast Asian folklore have a play in the origin of folk tales? They often have stupid, nameless heroes marrying nameless princesses, goddesses, or spirits who demand silly tasks and have an end focus on marriage.
Yes, but that is again at the level of motif indexes. If you can always find such similarities. Let me make my point clear. To explain the origin of the fairy tale is to explain its structure. It's such a hopelessly close-knit structure. Those who have heard the name of Vladimir Prop would, of course, recognize that I simply repeated Prop's so-called functions. It all begins in a certain way and moves irrevocably toward the end, with all kinds of digressions. And that's why Prop wanted initiation, like St. Eve, because initiation is structured. Stories are told to the prospective initiate, what will happen to you here, what will happen to you there. But Prop wrote a whole book about it. But the problem is that he pieced together initiation details from the cultures of the whole world. He could never produce a single initiation ceremony that looked even remotely like the fairy tale. Of course, if you take a piece here and a piece there, that is again, if you take motifs and put them together, then it will be like a fairy tale cake. You find everything, crumbs from here, crumbs from there, and then there's a cake which is 7 feet tall. There is not a single story of initiation that looks like the fairy tale. That is, Prop was very smart. So was St. Eve. That's why they didn't believe in Lang's theory or in Müller's theory. They wanted structure, the only people who wanted structure. All the rest was much worse, because Freud wanted dreams and sexuality, and that is panhuman. That has no chronological value at all. The same with archetypes. Yes, of course, we have those archetypes. If we believe in Jung's archetypes, fine. I have no quarrel with archetypes. I have quarrel mainly with his style. Jung tends to repeat the same thing 50 times, and after the 50th time you think that you believe him. He's more like a preacher than like a scholar. It's not like a system of saying 1, 2, 3, now we can have the conclusion. If you are told 50 times that there is such an archetype, you begin to believe, yes, there is archetype. Oh yes, I know it's in me. But if you are serious, you won't believe these things. You will ask, where did the structure come from? And you will ask, is it aristocratic or popular? Never mind the human archetype. Is it something that comes from up down or goes from down up? And so on. And this has never been explained. All right, Michelle, there are other questions.
Yeah, actually, Leo Dannersmith has a question, I think, related a little bit to your last point. He asked, do you think the shift towards favoring the nameless nobody and creating a family could signify change in European values in the early modern period?
No, no. In folklore, remember, I stay with folklore. No. In heroic poetry, the hero overcomes a maiden. And then there is family life. But the main point, as in the Nibelungen, is not on creating a family, but on overcoming a heroic bride. And that is a very important point. Of course, some of the motifs must have seeped into the fairy tale. Our recalcitrant princess is very much like a heroic bride. True. That is, I say, once you begin to compare motifs, the similarities are so obvious, only that the princess in the fairy tale is so dumb. And in Italy, much better, Turandot. This is much better, but still it's very clear that that Turandot wants to marry a very smart husband. And who would say anything against that idea? Who wants to marry a fool? Turandot wants to have a very smart husband. But in our fairy tale, this difficult task has been degraded to an absolutely ridiculous proportions. Here is a ring, I'll throw the ring into the sea, get it. What does that prove? What does that show? That the woman doesn't want to marry? There has never been a situation in the world in which women didn't want to marry. That's ridiculous. There could have been some women who for some reason didn't want to marry. But if you speak about types rather than about individuals, of course not. Of course, marriage was the main thing in life. If you didn't marry, there would be no family, there would be no children, you would be devoured by your enemies. Who will plow your lot? Of course, there were families, but this severe focus on family life, that the hero must marry a princess, that's not in heroic poetry. You can't derive this from heroic poetry, just as you cannot derive heroic poetry from myths. So once you begin to compare, the important thing, stay away from the motif index. Similarities are everywhere. And they're very important similarities and very telling similarities. Of course, the fairy tale grew out of some nucleus of the same motif index, but everything has been turned upside down, inside out. Everything is wrong. The motifs are the same, but everything is wrong. It's like having letters, but not in their proper order. It's not an alphabet. You need an alphabet. You need structure. And that's why the question is, why the problem is insoluble at the moment. Perhaps somebody will be able to solve it.
Okay, great. I think Jonas also has a question. He says, thank you very much for the talk. Do you see any parallels between David and Goliath and the later motifs of weaklings and fairy tales?
Do I see any?
Parallels between David and Goliath? So maybe biblical
Of
tales
course,
and
of
later.
course, of course, of course. Once you find a motif, of course, you immediately find something. Only with the David and Goliath, the situation is slightly different. David didn't kill Goliath in order to marry. Goliath didn't leave home. Goliath was there, was smart, and David was smart, and Goliath was dumb. So it's not the triumph of a dumbling, but the triumph of a smart, weak fellow. Yes, that we find in the folklore, in Hebrew folklore and in Greek folklore. The story is very often on the side of a sufferer, so to speak. And David was not simply his enemy, Goliath's enemy. He did it for a heroic purpose. Goliath had to be conquered for that. When we look at romances, for example, Daphne and Chloe, for example, the lovers are so inexperienced that they're sweet. They're almost as sweet as the characters in 19th century novel. They're full of desire and libido, but they don't know how to make sex. So the story is all on their side. Oh, poor kids. So finally, the hero goes to a prostitute who teaches him how to do it. He returns very happy, and they live happily ever after. Yes, we do find such situations. We do find all kinds of motifs which are very close to what we find here. Structure, structure, structure. That's what we need, and that we never find anywhere. Samson, for example, if we return to the Old Testament, Samson is an outsider, and even for heroic poetry, Samson is a very unusual character, and you find many situations in the books of the Old Testament that remind us of what we find in the fairy tale. Of course, the motifs grew out of the motif index. The problem is why they were so arranged and rearranged in such a very unusual way. And to me, it's also a problem of chronology. It's probably because I have studied phonetic change and studied it decades before I came to folklore. The important thing is not why one vowel turned into another vowel, but why it did it when it did, and under what circumstances. More or less the same thing.
Okay, and it looks like we have one last question from Maggie Katambe, and she asks, it's hard to track down the origin of oral literature, but when written down, is it possible to tease out motivations for telling a story?
We can, could you repeat the end of the question?
Yeah, is it possible to tease out motivations for telling a story when it's written down?
Yes, would be nice to find that motivation. That is probably question number one. What made people tell these stories? That's almost like reformulating the question about the origin of these tales. Who was the first to think of this strange plot, and why? The motivation, if I have a few minutes, I can say something about it. One idea is that the fairy tale, if we take not the Italian version, but the Slavic Norwegian mainly, it is about the triumph of the downtrodden peasant over the ruling class. That it came from, that was a very typical Russian theory, Soviet theory, of course, that the motivation was to vindicate the underdog, which is such a human impulse. This is such an obvious motivation to help the sufferer, to allow the sufferer marry the princess. That could have been it if the origin of the fairy tale is really in the peasant community. And that is, as I said, something that we know nothing about. Yes, perhaps, but the first fairy tales, all those three oranges and three, they are all with princes and not with peasants. So it's equally possible that the story, when it reached the peasant milieu, became what it became. But the motivation of helping the underdog is obvious, of course.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you for staying a little bit longer to answer questions, and apologies to you and to the audience for the mix up at the beginning, but I'm very glad that you were able to join us and give us our annual lecture that we have in December. So thank you. Thank you, Professor Lieberman. Thanks to everyone. And I hope you have a good rest of the week. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank those who managed to connect me, to Zoom me in.
I think Jonas and Alex, yeah, we're working.
Because I was totally lost. I was supposed to have a link, which didn't appear. Alex said, you will have a link, you're a host, and you have a link, you just click, and everything will be there, and nothing clicked. So thank you so very much.
I have no idea what happened, but I'm glad that you eventually were able to join us after so much frustration. And I apologize. I know it was very frustrating.
Emily, how many people did we have for this Zoom session?
We had many, 50 something. So
oh, that's wonderful.
And everyone waited, I think.
Yes,
so
50 people waiting for the speaker.
Yeah.
That's a heroic deed. It's worthy of being commemorated.
Well, they got to hear this wonderful talk, so it was worth the wait.
There is a very funny letter to me. Trials and magical helpers. Indeed, yeah. Indeed. My great thanks are to my magical helpers. I was as helpless as the dumbest hero in the fairy tale.
Or maybe you were the epic hero, right? You overcame the
overcame the dragon. All right.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you again.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.